Moscow, January 1960. What is this? I asked Mr. Satnyakov as I reached across the top of his highly polished teak wood desk, stained with burn marks from Cuban cigars, to take the thick folder which he slid towards me. Pavel Satyakov was a well-built man with thick, dark hair framing his receding hairline. Years ago, he was a journalist, just as I am now, before the party appointed him editor-in-chief of Pravda back in 1956. Though in his early 50s, Satyakov still retained the inquisitive demeanor of a young and enthusiastic correspondent. This was an aspect about him that seemed to keep him looking perpetually young. He motioned for me to take a seat in front of his desk as his secretary, a beautiful young intern named Dorothea, turned to leave his spacious and very well-organized office. "Miss Ilyan," said Mr. Satyakov in his baritone voice that always reminded me of that American singer, Elvis Presley. "Some tea for myself and Mr. Zimyanin, please, and kindly make it hot." "Of course, Mr. Satyakov," smiled Dorothea as she closed the door behind her, shielding us from the noise of endless conversations, typewriters, and telephone calls which one would expect to come from the party's official newspaper workroom. Outside the Pravda office building, Moscow was blanketed under a foot of snow, and our building's heating system was struggling just to keep the temperature at a tolerable level. "That, my dear Mikhail," said Mr. Satyakov, turning his attention to me, "is your next assignment. Look it over, my boy. Do you remember the story?" A sticker on the folder read,
Kholat Shaki Mountain Incident, February 1959.
"This happened a little over a year ago," I said, opening up the file and removing several newspaper articles, pictures, as well as official government documents which I had not seen before. The story caused quite a stir of speculation for a while. "Indeed," said Mr. Satyakov, staring at me intently. I took out a few grainy black and white photographs of young people dressed as if they were going hiking in the mountains. It was attached by paperclip to an article dated 20th February 1959, which read,
Army and local militia units search for missing hikers on snow-covered Kholat Shaki slopes.
The article mentioned that 9 students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute had formed a hiking club and had set out in January of that year on a hiking trip up the eastern slopes of the Kholat Mountains, which the native Manasi people called
the Dead Mountain.
The eldest of the 9 hikers was a 38-year-old male named Semyon A. Zolotaryov. The youngest was a 20-year-old female named Ludmila A. Dubenina. The leader of the hiking expedition was a 23-year-old radio engineering student by the name of Igor A. Dyatlov. The article continues that when the 20th of February rolled around and no telegram of the hikers' progress was received, the worried families appealed to the military and locals to begin a search of the area, as a winter storm had arisen in the slopes sometime between late January to the first week of February. The second set of pictures that I looked at was much clearer and obviously taken with a higher quality camera. The 4 images showed several men in dark uniforms looking over what remained of a campsite on a gently sloping hill which was covered in snow. The remains of a relatively large tent, half buried in the snow, was in the foreground with only the front and rear stakes sticking up. The sides and the rear flap had collapsed as if they had been cut away, leaving only the front flap drooping off the stake. These pictures were attached to a larger newspaper article dated the 1st of March, 1959, which read,
Searchers find damaged and abandoned campsite.
The subheading of the article read,
Tents found torn and cut open from the inside, and 9 sets of footprints seen running towards the woods.
"I mean, this was an unusual case," I said, reading the names of the 9 victims. All 9 of the victims were found some distance away from the shelter of the tent, wearing very little clothing. Some of them weren't even wearing socks. It was concluded that 6 of the hikers, including Dyatlov, died of extreme hypothermia. But 3 of the hikers, including young Miss Dubenina, and the eldest, Mr. Zolotaryov, died of severe chest trauma and not hypothermia. I put down the file and looked at Mr. Satyakov. Why are we looking into this again, sir? Last May, the official investigation closed with the finding that the 9 died of fatal natural forces. There was no evidence of other footprints outside of the 9 hikers, and thus no ruling of foul play by the Manasi people or predation by wild animals. There came a knocking at the door as Miss Ilian returned with a serving tray of spiced Kuzmi tea. Pouring the steaming drink into 2 china cups, Miss Ilian politely excused herself, leaving Mr. Satyakov and I to finish our discussion. "Again, you are right, my dear Mikhail," said Satyakov, taking a sip of his hot tea and smiling in approval as he leaned back in his chair. "That is the official finding of what is now being called the Dyatlov Pass incident, in memory of Igor Dyatlov, and I assume that would have been the official conclusion and the case would be closed, except for 2 details which did not make it into the official statement on the matter." I sweetened my tea with a little honey and blew into it to cool it down before taking a sip. The hot, spicy beverage warmed me greatly, instantly taking the chill out of my body. I arched my eyebrows at my editor-in-chief. There was something left out of the official conclusion? I asked, not really surprised that the party would leave out other details in order to preserve security and order. Mr. Satyakov took another sip of the tea and said nothing as he motioned with a nod for me to keep looking into the file. There were 2 other reports in their own separate envelopes, and both of these designated as secret by the Ministry of Defense. I looked at my boss with hesitation. "Go ahead, Mikhail," said Mr. Satyakov. "Go ahead and open them." Trying to restrain my eagerness, I opened the first letter, dated the 26th of February. It was a copy of a simple 1-page memo written by an officer in charge of an Army radiation detection unit that was part of the search team. The letter was addressed to an Army divisional commander stationed in the area. In short, it stated that low levels of radiation had been found on the clothing which the hikers wore, but none on the clothing which was found inside the remains of their tent. Curious, I opened the second envelope. This one contained copies of 4 separate reports, 2 from Manasi villagers, 1 from a hunter, and 1 from a military meteorological unit who had been on the ridgeline several kilometers opposite of the slope in which the hikers had camped. All of them describing seeing some type of glowing orange orb descending out of the sky like fire in the vicinity of Dyatlov's Pass. As I sat contemplating the ramifications of what I had just read, I noticed a small brown envelope like one to keep photographs in, tucked under the last report. Taking another hot sip of my tea, I nearly spat it out onto Satyakov's desk as I pulled the photograph on the envelope. "Good Lord," I said. "Mr. Satyakov, what is that?" "Like I said," my boss responded calmly. "The government was well and perfectly happy with the conclusion of their investigation, and would have been content to leave the story as is." He leaned forward and put his elbows on his desk, his eyebrows furrowed in concern. "However, since the investigation concluded in May of last year, 17 other people have vanished in the vicinity of the pass. 3 disappeared in May that year, then 4 in December, and 10 since January of this year. Mikhail, the military is going back in to Dyatlov's Pass with considerably more resources. News of the disappearances cannot be covered up for long, especially with the military going back in force. They think that it is wise to have a civilian correspondent embedded with them, which is why I'm sending you." I leaned back, looking in disbelief at the picture. "And they think that the disappearances of Dyatlov's group and the subsequent missing people have something to do with the thing in this picture?" "Perhaps. That is what they are going in to find out. You will be filling your reports directly to the mission commander. His name is Colonel Stanislav Andreev. The military feels that having a civilian reporter as opposed to a military one will bring some element of transparency to the operation, or rather investigation. Of course, anything you report will naturally have to go through military intelligence to be edited and redacted in order to keep security in order. It was a 5-hour flight from Moscow International to the Urals, not including the 2-hour delay while maintenance crews de-iced the runways. It was a little after 3 p.m. when our sturdy Aeroflot IL-18 turboprop landed on the snow-swept runway of Koltsovo International. The metal stairs were brought to the plane, and after the doors opened, the biting chill in the air drove away any heat in the passenger cabin. And here I thought Moscow was a deep freezer. I gathered my things and descended the stairs to the tarmac, pulling the hood of my white winter coat over my face. To my surprise, an army major wearing a heavy cold weather coat and his driver were waiting for me with a Gaz 67 Jeep at the foot of the stairs, a look of annoyance on his face. "Mr. Zemyanin," he said. "Mr. Mikhail Zemyanin." "Yes, Major, that's me." The name on the officer's uniform read Rogov. "You're late," he said briskly, grabbing my bag and putting it in the trunk. I had been told specifically what I could and could not bring by the military, which was basically warm clothing for the trip to the Urals, toilet articles, a camera, and a few other small things. The military said that they would provide everything that I would need for the duration of their investigation. The major, Rogov, looked suspiciously at me when he noticed that I'd rather keep my camera with me rather than have it packed in the back. It belonged to the newspaper, and I could not afford to have it damaged. "There was a 2-hour weather delay in Moscow," I said. "I'm sorry." "I see," answered Rogov, ushering me into the back seat before climbing into the passenger side. "Colonel Andreev will not be pleased with the delay. He was expecting you hours ago. You and the others were the last element that he was waiting for before he could start this operation." "The others?" I asked. "You'll see, Mr. Zemyanin," Rogov answered. "Driver, take us to the hangar." The 5-minute Jeep ride took us across the entire airport to a lonely, dilapidated hangar on the far side of the runway. In front of it was parked a military Mi-4 transport helicopter painted in shades of white, light olive, and light gray. There was a big red star emblazoned on its side. The engines were already started and warming by the time we arrived as the major leapt from his seat before the Jeep fully stopped and ran to a door next to the hangar that was barely on its hinges. Not knowing what to do next, I simply followed Major Rogov out of the Jeep. Throwing open the door to the hangar, Major Rogov shouted, "Okay, the reporter is here. Pick up your gear and get on the helicopter quickly. The weather is getting worse and the window is closing to fly. Colonel Andreev does not want to waste another day." Immediately, 8 young soldiers began filing out of the ramshackle old hangar, each carrying SKS rifles, as well as peculiar-looking equipment, which I would not usually associate with a combat unit. This was some kind of specialized unit, and the equipment and devices which they hauled into the helicopter filled me with apprehension. The implications of what we were bringing with us made me extremely nervous. Why would the Army need so much radiation detection equipment? Turning to me, the major looked down at my camera and said, "You won't be taking any pictures until you officially have permission from Colonel Andreev." I understand, Major," I answered. Though the sky was still relatively clear, the wind was picking up, indicating that another snow flurry was not far off. "Where are we going?" "Khanty-Mansiysk. It's about 400 kilometers northeast of here." Major Rogov turned to fetch my bag from the back of the Jeep and handed it to me. "You'll be there within 2 hours or so." I waited until the soldiers loaded all of their equipment into the helicopter, as the rotors began picking up speed and spinning faster. Though the Mi-4 could hold up to 14 soldiers, it was still rather cramped with the 9 of us in the passenger cabin, what with all the radiological detection equipment that the soldiers brought. Yelling to be heard above the roar of the rotor blades, the major had some last-minute instructions to the junior lieutenant who was in charge of the group of soldiers, telling them that he would be arriving separately later that evening. I had boarded last and was seated near the exit door when Major Rogov came to me and yelled, "Mr. Zemyanin, after you get to Khanty-Mansiysk, as soon as you get the opportunity, go see Sergeant Galkin. He is the unit supply sergeant and armorer. He will have your additional winter clothing and other supplies that you will need to complete your mission." "Okay," I yelled down at the captain from my seat, perched up in the helicopter. "Sergeant Galkin, thank you." "And one more thing," yelled Rogov as the helicopter throttled up to take off. "Ask Sergeant Galkin if you can sign for a pistol, just in case." The long helicopter flight through the bleak, cold skies was reasonably comfortable. The cabin heaters were working fine, and the vibration of the engines served to make some of the soldiers drowsy. I tried to strike up a conversation with the team's commanding officer, a young junior lieutenant named Leonid Orlov. He stated that he and his men had recently completed training in the use of the Army's most advanced radiological detecting and monitoring equipment when they were suddenly tasked to be part of this mission to the Ural Mountains. He mentioned that there would also be 2 mechanized infantry companies attached to the mission, but aside from that, he had little other useful information. Seeing as I was a civilian reporter who had also embedded to this mission, Orlov asked me if I had any information about the nature of this unusual assignment, and if the rumors were true that we would be looking for missing people around what they were now calling Dyatlov's Pass. I shook my head and said that I was as clueless as everybody else, even as I remembered the picture of the strange object that I saw in Mr. Satyakov's office. Lieutenant Orlov nodded, though I sensed that he didn't quite believe me. To my great surprise, Khanty-Mansiysk Airport looked more like a military encampment rather than small regional airport it was. Spread out across the small parking lot and runway, there were military vehicles of all shapes and sizes. BTR-152, 6-wheeled light armored transport vehicles, newer BTR-50s, tracked armored transports, and several GAZ-67 Jeeps. We landed next to a line of Mi-4 transport helicopters and smaller Mi-1 light utility helicopters. Lieutenant Orlov immediately ordered his men to secure their weapons and equipment and get off the helicopter. Though it was after 6 p.m., the skies were noticeably clearer in this higher elevation, though still quite cold. Another captain, who was wearing a comfortable-looking tan fleece winter coat and a thick fleece Ushanka winter cap, was waiting for our helicopter to land. He directed Orlov's men to secure their equipment and make their way to one of the 12 tents which were erected next to the airport's modest terminal building. Turning to me and Lieutenant Orlov, the captain introduced himself. "I'm Captain Sidorev, 15th Mountain Infantry Battalion of the 128th Motor Rifle Division. You will be following under our command. Follow me to the terminal, gentlemen. Colonel Andreev has turned it into his command post for this operation, and he is eager to get started." Captain Sidorev turned and walked briskly towards the glass-fronted, white terminal building which had recently been rebuilt and expanded. As I shouldered my travel bag and followed Orlov and Captain Sidorev across the tarmac towards the airport terminal, I was puzzled to see several dozen of our soldiers hustling about attending to their vehicles, weapons, and equipment. I was even more surprised to see them mounting DSHK 1938 heavy machine guns on both the tracked and wheeled armored vehicles. I had served with the 106th Guard Division during the Great Patriotic War as an airborne infantryman, so to me this looked less like preparations for a military search mission to find missing people, and more like preparations for a ground assault in enemy territory. My mind was racing faster than the chilling winds which blew around us as we neared the terminal. Could that be the answer? Over 3 million Germans invaded our country during the war. Could a group of those rogue fascist Nazi soldiers have held out in the vast, lonely Ural Mountains, killing anyone who might have gotten too close to their hideaway? It isn't an unheard of scenario, as abandoned Japanese soldiers were still turning up on isolated islands in the South Pacific who don't know that the war is long over. That had to be the answer. But then why the need for radiological equipment? Worse, could the Americans somehow be involved? Could they have used some type of weapon against us? One which left radioactive residue behind? The warm rush of air greeted us as we entered the building, the expanded terminal empty of all civilian travelers. "The government closed down the airport to all travel when this investigation started," said Captain Sidorev, picking up the pace as he ascended the main stairwell to the second floor. "No civilian flights are allowed in or out of the area within a radius of 1,500 kilometers. and only authorized military flights are allowed inside of the exclusion zone. He turned to me, saying, Mr. Zemyanin, I'm not sure if you have already been told, but all correspondence that you write and photographs that you take must go through the Colonel personally before they may be sent to your editor. I understand, Captain, I said as we reached the second story. Unlike downstairs, the second story was awash with military activity. Rooms lined the large circular landing which looked down on the ground floor, each seemingly assigned to fulfill a certain function. As Captain Sidorev led us around the landing, I saw a large room filled with communication specialists, another with maps and meteorological specialists, radar operators, surface-to-air missile operations specialists, and a host of other specialized military elements which, apparently, were needed for this so-called investigation. Sidorev stopped in front of a wooden door and knocked 3 times before turning the knob. The door opened to a surprisingly small room which looked to have been converted into an office. A grim-faced officer with close-cropped white hair and cold blue, unblinking eyes that seemed to criticize everything he saw looked up at us from behind a simple metal desk. Colonel Andreev, saluted Captain Sidorev. The last elements have arrived. Thank you, Sidorev, said the colonel, standing up abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. Rejoin your men. They will have an early morning start tomorrow, and I want all equipment and vehicles staged and ready to go no later than 0600 hours. Sidorev saluted again before he turned to leave. Colonel Andreev was a huge man with broad shoulders. Instead of wearing a formal officer's uniform complete with the rows of medals he had no doubt earned, Andreev wore a combat uniform, the same as his men. I knew that this was no parade ground officer. Andreev was all business. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table and glaring at Lieutenant Orlov and me. You're late, gentlemen. I expected you hours ago. Apologies, sir, stammered Lieutenant Orlov, coming to attention and saluting. You see, the weather... Lieutenant Orlov! Colonel Andreev's deep, menacing voice quickly silenced the young lieutenant. How old are you? 23, sir, gulped poor Lieutenant Orlov. 23, huh? Replied Colonel Andreev. Too young to have participated in the Great Patriotic War, then. At 21, I was a lieutenant just like you, and I commanded a battery of Katyusha rocket launchers. During those dark days, we did not have the luxury of blaming the weather for failure. Not when our infantrymen needed us to continue the fight against the fascists. Do you understand, Lieutenant? Colonel, I said, seeing young Lieutenant Orlov seeming to shrink. Lieutenant Orlov and his men were late because they were waiting for me to arrive. I am aware of that, said Andreev, holding up his hand at me while leaving his gaze firmly on Orlov. Lieutenant Orlov, is your equipment operational? Has it been winterized against the cold? Yes, sir, replied Lieutenant Orlov. And did Mr. Zemyanin discuss any aspect of the investigation with you on the ride over? Andreev ignored me, holding his gaze on the lieutenant. What, sir? Said Orlov, briefly looking at me nervously before returning his attention to the colonel. No, sir. Said Andreev, eyeing me with doubt on his face. Okay, Lieutenant Orlov. Half of your men will be attached to Captain Sidorev's infantry company. The other half will go with Captain Kravtsov's men. However, your men will be under command of Major Rogov, my executive officer. They will report immediately to Major Rogov and only Major Rogov if they pick up any unusual increases in radiation during the course of the operation. Understand, Lieutenant? Yes, sir, replied Lieutenant Orlov, confidence slowly returning to his voice. May I know what we are looking for? No, replied Andreev. You and your men will do your duties, nothing more, nothing less, and with no excuses for failure. At 0500 hours in the morning, you and your men will report to Major Rogov to receive your orders. Your senior sergeant will lead one team and you the other. You're dismissed, Lieutenant. Orlov saluted swiftly before leaving, grateful that the ordeal of meeting the mission commander was over. He flashed me a sympathetic look before leaving the room. You're still a grumpy old ogre. Do you know that, Stanislav? I said, after Lieutenant Orlov had closed the door behind him. "Do you always insist on making junior officers shit themselves?" Andreev chuckled as he stepped around and took a seat on the corner of the desk. "Kids these days, always asking questions instead of simply following orders. We would never have beaten the fascists with officers like that." He pulled out a cigarette and lit it before offering one to me. "How is your mother doing, Mikhail?" My older cousin asked me. "How is Auntie Milian?" "She's doing fine," I answered, accepting the smoke. "Good. Good to hear," said Andreev, smiling, inhaling deeply as he looked at a military map on the wall of the surrounding area. Circles were drawn on it, indicating that approximate places of the latest disappearances of people in areas of increased levels of radiation. Normally, I would rather have one of our military reporters with us as opposed to having a civilian journalist with us, but the Kremlin thought it was wise to have a civilian with us for credibility purposes once we conclude this investigation and make the results public. Colonel Andreev Stanislav and I grew up together. He was my cousin, older than me by 3 years. He'd always been the strong, confident one while I tended to be more shy and timid. I always looked up to him because of his brave and daring personality, and no more so when we went camping in the Kurgan Mountains. I was 10, and Stanislav was 13 when we hiked up the foothills of the Kurgan just outside our village near Moscow. I had caught some nice trout at the stream and was hiking back to our little camp when the scent attracted a rather large and hungry wolf. Not thinking to simply drop my pole and my catch, I ran with them up the trail, screaming for Stanislav to come and help. The wolf was nearly upon me when Stanislav appeared, suddenly at my side, batting the wolf with a sturdy branch which he had set ablaze with our campfire. As he got older, Stanislav had garnered the reputation of being a hard, stern man, uncompromising and intolerant of ineptitude and incompetence, especially during the war. But to me, he's always been the big brother that I never had who could save me from wolves. "So," I said, "what exactly are we investigating? Why does the army need air defense missiles and heavy machine guns to conduct a search for missing people?" "Mikhail," my cousin said calmly, though he stared at me with cold, unblinking eyes. "You served as a paratrooper during the war, so you know the value of secrecy and the importance of military intelligence. It is therefore of the utmost importance that the people trust in the results of our findings. More importantly, we need the Americans to trust in our findings. Therefore, nothing you write and no pictures you take are to leave from here until I personally say that it can go." He paused and inhaled deeply on his cigarette, though he never took his eyes off me. "You came highly recommended by Pravda's editor-in-chief, Mikhail. However, if you cannot follow orders, you can also be highly recommended to be replaced. It's not my call. Those are simply my orders." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled a picture out of a small envelope, placing it on the desk in front of the colonel. "Stanislav," I said, "is this what we're searching for?" Stanislav picked up the photograph and stared at the image of the glowing object seemingly descending from a cloudy sky. The object seemed to be metallic and emitted a bright orange flame. "I am aware that you were given this picture, cousin," said Colonel Andreev, taking the cigarette out of his mouth. He dropped the picture on the desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a large mailing envelope. "Here, take a look at this picture." The picture was the same as the one I had of the mysterious object, only blown up in a greater detail. I put my hand to my mouth, my mind reeling at the implications of what I was seeing before me. "As you can see," said Andreev, "we enlarged the image so that you can just barely see the swastika on the side." "So this is a search mission, but we're not looking for missing hikers and campers," I thought. I put my travel bag down on the narrow cot in my room. I told Andreev that I would be perfectly happy to stay with the common soldiers in one of the tents outside, but the colonel, my older cousin, insisted that I stay inside one of the small rooms in the terminal building which, to be honest, looked to have been nothing but a large, windowless janitor's closet. that was only large enough for an army cot, a small folding table, and room on the floor for me to drop my travel bag. It was not hard to summarize that the reason he kept me inside the terminal was because the Colonel wanted to keep close tabs on me, as he had complete and total control of what news left this base. It was understandable that the Colonel did not want the true nature of this mission to get out, or what we were actually looking for. Moreover, it was especially important that the Americans be completely left in the dark about what was happening here. Telling me where I could find Sergeant Galkin, Andreev dismissed me abruptly, telling me to be dressed and ready to move out in the morning. I would be reporting to the intelligence officer, Major Rogov, who I had met at Koltsovo Airport. There was a small wooden table in the room where I sat my camera and my typewriter before I stepped out again to find the terminal's baggage collection point, which the Army had turned into a unit supply area. Sergeant Galkin was a stout, bearded, aging supply sergeant who, like me, was a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, and who was biding his time before he retired. Barking orders at his 2 supply assistants, Galkin issued me 2 sets of white, military cold-weather uniforms and a large overcoat. It had been a few years since I put on a military uniform, over a decade, and I had put on quite a bit of weight. Finding the overcoat that they had issued me was rather small, I decided that I would stay with my much better fitting and much warmer civilian overcoat. Sergeant Galkin also gave me a set of winter gloves and a blanket, as well as a few notepads, pens, and extra flashes and rolls of film for my camera.
Colonel Andreev said to issue you everything you need in order to document this mission, said Sergeant Galkin. Is there anything else you might need, Mr. Semyenin?
Is there some reason why Major Rogov would suggest that I be issued a pistol? I asked. Sergeant Galkin scratched his beard.
No reason that I can think of. This is just a search mission for lost civilians. But if Major Rogov suggested that you carry a pistol, it would be best that you carry a pistol.
Turning, Sergeant Galkin bellowed.
Damn it, Private! Lad, get up off your ass and issue Mr. Semyenin here a Makarov.
Dinner consisted of pre-packaged military field rations distributed by Sergeant Galkin and his assistants in the converted supply area, along with a ladle full of potato soup and a chunk of freshly baked bread. The regular infantry soldiers took their trays back outside to eat their meals in their tents, but for those of us housed inside the terminal, tables had been set out where we could eat in the relative warmth and comfort of our building. Colonel Andreev and his infantry company commanders, Captain Sidorev and Kravtsov, as well as the executive officer, Major Rogov, were sitting at a large table, all dining on the same field rations that the regular soldiers were eating, and seemingly discussing final details of the coming mission. Over dinner, I discovered that I was not the only civilian who had joined this mission. There were 2 others. A bispectacled, elderly man with a dark gray and white beard, wearing a worn but warm-looking brown coat, was sitting at a small round table with a young lady with pale skin and light brown hair tied to in a tight bun. She was wearing khaki pants and a matching tight-fitting khaki jacket, a white scarf loosely wrapped around her neck. As I approached the table, I could hear the older gentleman regaling the young lady with tales of the war.
Ah, Alina, he said, waving his hand around his head. The Battle of Kursk was not as bad as everyone says it was. It was far worse. Did I tell you about the time when...
Excuse me? I said as I approached the table, metal tray in hand. I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you mind if I joined you for dinner? The young lady, whom the older gentleman referred to as Alina, looked at me and smiled broadly. She was far more attractive up close than at a distance.
Of course, sir. Professor, you wouldn't mind, would you?
The elderly man looked up at me, somewhat perturbed that I had unintentionally interrupted his tale.
Why, no, of course not. Please join us.
He scooted his chair over as I set my tray down. There was barely enough room at the table for all 3 of our metal trays.
My name is Yevgeny Gulebev. I'm a professor of history at St. Petersburg University, specializing in the Great Patriotic War. And this lovely young lady is my assistant, Miss Alina Ivanov, an intern specializing in Nazi occultism. Thank you. I returned their smiles. I feel rather uncomfortable eating with our young military lads. My name is Zemyenin, Mikhail Zemyenin. I'm a correspondent for Pravda. Ah, yes, said the professor. I'm familiar with your articles, Mr. Zemyenin. You have a way of getting the facts out to the people without kowtowing too much to the party narrative. I must admit, I am rather surprised that the military allowed a civilian journalist on this mission. Indeed, Professor. I nodded. Usually the military would have their own correspondents on operations such as this. I'm curious, though. Why do they need a history professor and I looked with even more bewilderment at Alina, a specialist in Nazi occultism, for this mission.
To tell you the truth, Mr. Zemyenin,
said Alina, regarding me with bright blue eyes and smiling with thin, perky lips.
Professor Gulebev and I were wondering the same thing. The military had requested both of us be a part of this mission to search for missing people. But to be honest, I don't know what good we would do. Professor Gulebev even asked Colonel Andreev as much.
Really? I looked at the professor. Yes, indeed, he said. I did question the colonel as to why the military needed us, and also asked what exactly were we looking for. And what did the colonel say? He said that we would know what we were here once we found out what we were looking for, said the professor. Even the soldiers don't seem to be curious as to why we are here with so many military assets and weapons. They simply think that they're searching for missing people. Curious, I said.
And what about you, Mr. Zemyenin?
Asked Alina.
Would you have some idea of what we are really searching for?
I might. I could not say no to her beautiful, captivating eyes. Although I knew that I was not to disclose anything of the true nature of this mission, I told the professor and Alina everything that I knew so far about the Dyatlov Pass incident, the strange, glowing orange orb seen in the sky, and of the photograph that was taken the night that the hikers perished, the one which seemed to show that the glowing orb was some kind of metallic craft, and of the Nazi symbol emblazoned on its side. Said the professor, nodding silently when I was done telling them what I knew. He noticed that Colonel Andreev was done with his meeting and was now walking across the room towards our table. Alina, said the professor, would you please be a dear and refresh my cup of tea? I'm afraid that it had grown quite cold.
Of course,
smiled Alina, hopping up and taking the professor's cup.
Mr. Zemyenin, would you like some more tea?
No, thank you, I answered.
Okay.
She answered, smiling sweetly as she passed Colonel Andreev.
Good evening, sir.
Colonel Andreev nodded in return, producing what I could only assume to be a smile from the usual dour and sour expression on his face. I'm glad that you all have had a chance to meet, said Andreev. Would you gentlemen mind if I sat down? He said as he pulled up the chair in which Alina had been sitting. Please join us, Colonel, said the professor. We were just discussing the mission in the morning and contemplating what we should pack and what needs to stay behind. I see, answered Colonel Andreev, eyeing me suspiciously. Well, you needn't worry about that. There's been a slight change in plans for the three of you in the morning. I raised an eyebrow in curiosity. Really, sir? Yes, Mikhail, said Andreev, offering us a cigarette before taking one himself. I have decided to keep all of you here at the terminal while the two infantry companies conduct their searches around the slopes of the Kholat Mountains and Dyatlov's Pass. There was no sense in you three trudging through the snow and ice with the rest of the lads for however many days the search will take. But, sir, I protested, I thought my assignment was to take pictures and record the mission. It is, nodded Andreev. Rest assured, if and when my mind find anything of,
significance. You and the professor will be flown out straight away. Professor, did I hear you mention that Alina could speak and understand German? Why, yes, nodded the professor. She had to learn the language in order to read and understand the manuscripts which we captured from the fascists during the war. Why? Will those skills be needed during this mission? My cousin, Colonel Andreev, glanced at me. Hopefully, he said. The sun still had not risen when I awoke in the morning. Not that it would have helped to stave off the chill outside. I rolled out of my cot, remembering that the last time I had slept on one was in my younger days in the army. Only this time, my back and butt were sore. Putting on my military-issued cold-weather clothing, I left my little janitor's closet and followed a line of young soldiers down to the supply area, where breakfast was being served. Already, the terminal was bustling with activity as the soldiers prepared themselves and their equipment, starting generators, warming up vehicle engines, and defrosting helicopter rotor blades in order to proceed with their mission. I sat with the professor and Alina at the same table we sat during dinner with my tray of eggs, fatty sausage, a chunk of bread, and hot tea. It wasn't much, but it was hot and far more preferable to field rations. With nothing for us to do for now, we all sat and watched as sergeants barked orders, soldiers stood in formation, and the first scout vehicles rolled out of the airport perimeter. Somewhat selfishly, I was grateful that we weren't going out with them, for, although the skies were clear and cloudless, it was still bitterly cold. Colonel Andreev's search pattern was actually fairly simple. Captain Maxim Kravtsov would lead his motorized infantry company of 120 men, along with 4 of Lieutenant Orlov's radiological detection team, 50 kilometers northwest of the airport, towards Dyatlov's Pass, and begin a cloverleaf search pattern in the area. They would also collect reports from the local Manasi people. This area was reportedly where most of the missing people from earlier this year had vanished. Meanwhile, Captain Sidorev and his motorized infantry company would fan out 50 kilometers northeast of the airport, and further away from Dyatlov's Pass, to an area more mountainous and forested, but where spikes in radiation levels had been recorded. Lieutenant Orlov and the rest of the radiological detection team would be assigned to Sidorev's unit. In addition, the executive officer, Major Rogov, would also be attached to Captain Sidorev's infantry company, although Major Rogov would be in overall command of the 2 infantry companies and would be coordinating their movements. This would be considerably more challenging if the initial search pattern failed to find anything of significance, at which case Colonel Andreev ordered that the units would then push out for an additional 25 kilometers, until they eventually found what Andreev was looking for. For his part, Colonel Andreev would remain at the airport terminal, which had been converted to the main base of operations. He would be in overall command of the entire operation, including communications and logistics. With him, along with all the air defense, communications, aviation, and supply assets, Colonel Andreev also retained a ready reserve platoon of Hilo-born riflemen, just in case. Ironically, although this military effort was several times larger than the one conducted just last year, there still weren't enough men or equipment to effectively search an area which could potentially span several hundred square kilometers. But bringing in more troops into the area would likely arouse attention, which the Kremlin did not want to attract to the area, as the US and its NATO allies had eyes and ears everywhere. Therefore, this would be a slow, tedious, and methodical search with what few assets we had. By 7:30 in the morning of the first day, both infantry companies had left the base, over 250 soldiers in all, along with their tracked and wheeled transport vehicles, while 2 Mi-4 helicopters, one attached to each company, scouted overhead. The professor, Alina, and I, along with Colonel Andreev, stood inside the large but crowded room which had been converted into the communications section. We were anxiously listening to radio traffic and monitoring the movement of both units.
In the middle of the room was a large round table upon which a topographical map of the search area was laid out. It was relatively easy going for the first half of the move, as the military vehicles were traveling on paved roads which had previously been cleared of snow and ice. However, as the ground sloped steadily upwards and the roads became trails, the going became noticeably slower, as the tracked vehicles were now at the head of the columns, plowing a path through the snow for the wheeled vehicles to follow. Captain Sidorev's column in the east was having a harder time than their sister company in the west, as the ground rose much steeper in the area to the northeast and their progress, though never halted by the snow, was still agonizingly slow. Meanwhile, overhead, the two helicopters scouted around and ahead of their respective units, each carrying with them 2 members of Lieutenant Orlov's radiation detection team and their equipment. Detecting almost no increase in radiation levels, Major Rogov instructed the pilots to fly as low to the ground as was safely possible, admonishing the pilots to avoid contact with the treetops. This produced a slight increase in the detection team's finding spikes in radiation levels, but not to a very significant degree, and all readings were still well within what could be considered safe levels. By late morning, the 2 infantry companies had finally reached their initial search areas, roughly 50 kilometers northwest and northeast of the airport. By this point, the helicopters had returned to the airport to refuel, having dropped off the radiation detection teams back with their assigned companies. Colonel Andreev held off on sending another airborne scouting sortie, coming to the conclusion that the detection equipment was more effective on the ground than hundreds of feet in the air. In any case, Captain Kravtsov's company operating to the northwest, near Dyatlov's Pass, did not detect any significant increases in radiation levels during their search pattern across the frozen, forested landscape. Over the radio, Major Rogov instead directed Kravtsov to make contact with the Manasi people living in the area to see if they had seen or heard anything unusual in the past months regarding the missing people, but to report immediately if they detected a significant spike in radiation. To the northeast, where the ground was steeper and more mountainous, Captain Sidorev's men were having slightly better luck, as Lieutenant Orlov and his men had detected several spikes in radiation levels in the area, although the readings were just inside the spectrum of what was considered safe. The infantrymen pushed through the close, packed trees, snow crunching under their snow boots and weapons ready as they followed the radiation detection team. But just like that, the needle on the detection meter would suddenly drop from light yellow to green, indicating that radiation levels had just returned to normal. During the course of their search of this sector, Captain Sidorev's men encountered this anomaly twice more in the area, encompassing roughly 6 square kilometers. While searching on foot, the vehicles having to stage in a large clearing as they could not traverse through the tightly packed forest of snow-covered trees. Major Rogov reported his finding to Colonel Andreev, suggesting that the anomaly responsible for creating these slight spikes in radiation levels appeared to be moving somehow. Determined to press on with the search before night fell, Major Rogov instructed Captain Sidorev to have his men mount up on their vehicles and continue to follow a well-worn path, which led upwards towards the mountain and deeper into the forest. 5 kilometers further, Orlov's team detected another spike in radiation, this time reaching levels higher than before but still within the safe zone. If only just barely. Once again, Captain Sidorev's men scoured the forest on both sides of the trail, and just as before, the residual radiation levels dropped back to normal. However, the soldiers did find something very peculiar in the form of a near, straight line of fallen trees, which stretched about 100 meters, and led to a wide clearing that disappeared further north. The path of fallen trees was about 100 meters wide, and it appeared as if the trees had fallen facing generally due north, as if something had pushed its way across the forest, headed towards the clearing. "What an odd sight," said Captain Sidorev to Major Rogov. "Any idea what might have caused this, sir?" Rogov shook his head. "Avalanche? Flash flood, perhaps? In any event, this happened fairly recently. I would say no more than 2 months. 3 at the most by the look of the vegetation which had sprung up amongst the fallen timber." "I agree, sir," answered Sidorev.
But what bothers me is that the spike in radiation levels goes right down the middle of that path. An hour before nightfall, Colonel Andreev radioed Major Rogov to order a halt for the day. The skies had been clear, no new snow had fallen, and thankfully, the meteorologists reported that the weather for the evening would remain the same. Captain Kravtsov's unit to the west would establish a camp on a gentle slope about a kilometer west of a Manasi village, while Captain Sidorev's men would pull off the trail they were on and spend the night in the tree line. Colonel Andreev sent 2 helicopters to resupply his 2 maneuver companies, with water and field rations, before it got too dark for night operations. But because Captain Sidorev's unit was so deep in the forest, the resupply had to be dropped in by sling load from the helicopter through the thick top cover of trees on the ground. I stayed in the communications room, intently listening to the last reports of the day coming in from our 2 infantry companies. To the west, Captain Kravtsov reported no detection of elevated radiation levels in their search area, while reports from the Manasi locals revealed nothing useful or significant to report regarding the missing people. Although 4 of the locals did say that their relatives living in villages further to the east had reported unusual occurrences revolving around large game animals being found slaughtered and eerie cries in the night. More than likely, however, the culprit was probably wolves. Colonel Andreev instructed Captain Kravtsov to continue his search in the morning, but if nothing useful is learned by afternoon, to shift his search and begin moving eastwards away from Dyatlov's Pass and towards Captain Sidorev's search area. Captain Sidorev's report was more compelling, with his unit encountering 3 mysterious spikes in radiation levels, but finding no source of the anomaly. And while the odd path of fallen trees they discovered was intriguing, it was not totally unexplainable. Major Rogov recommended that Sidorev's men continue pushing east in the morning, while continuing to use the helicopters to scout ahead, although clearly, the radiation detection teams were best kept on the ground. Colonel Andreev agreed, after which radio communication with the lads in the field was reduced to simple hourly communication checks for the remainder of the evening. After breakfast the next morning, we were again gathered in the communications room, waiting for reports from the field as the 2 infantry companies prepared to take up the search again. There was one unusual report, which came in at around 1 a.m., when a sentry at Captain Kravtsov's location reported eerie screeching sounds, which seemed to emanate from the forested hills several kilometers to the east across a shallow valley. The odd noises were faint, and the communications officer in charge of the night shift dismissed it as simply the howling echo of wind being carried across the night sky. By late morning, Captain Kravtsov's westward search was coming up empty, with no unusual spikes in radiation being encountered, and reports by the few Manasi people they encountered revealed nothing of significance. At 11 a.m., Major Rogov radioed Kravtsov, instructing him to begin moving east and continue their search. By the end of the day, the reports we received from the field were more productive, and far more ominous than the day before. Late in the day, Captain Kravtsov's men finally detected a slight radiation spike and, because the vehicles were still bound to roads and trails, a platoon of soldiers were sent into the woods to find the source of the radiation. After a while, they came across a small Manasi homestead hidden under the forest canopy. It was completely destroyed. The makeshift corral was torn down, and the ripped and gutted carcasses of 3 reindeer scattered about and half buried in the pink-stained snow. Kravtsov would report later that the bizarre occurrence which befell the small homestead probably happened 1 to 2 months prior. Of the inhabitants of the small wooden cabin, there was no sign, and any traces of footprints or tracks had long been covered by the recent snowfalls. The soldiers discovered a wide trail of fallen timber, similar to the one discovered by Sidorev's men the day before, leading northeast away from the homestead. The scout helicopter followed the trail of fallen trees for approximately 6 kilometers before it disappeared into a more thickly wooded area at the base of a line of steep, snow-covered foothills. Making camp at the location, Captain Kravtsov
doubled the sentry guards for the night, intending to investigate the trail once it became light again in the morning. Farther east, Captain Sidorev's unit encountered several more radiation spikes, one reading actually exceeding what was considered safe, but all eventually returning to normal after being followed for several hundred meters. The scout helicopter had discovered something unusual in a valley 3 kilometers to Sidorev's south, and they set forth to investigate. There, at a wide clearing in the base of the valley, they discovered the slaughtered carcasses of over a dozen ripped and torn reindeer. Whatever befell the animals had happened fairly recently, perhaps no more than a week or two, as the snowfall still showed faint traces of tracks, as if the reindeer had been chased out of the forest. In addition, bizarre holes in the ground, as if gigantic spears had been stabbed through the snow and earth, seemed to surround the dead animals. These strange tracks in the snow followed the reindeer out of the forest and overtook the animals before disappearing again through yet another trail of fallen timber. The carcasses of the dead animals seemed to not have suffered any type of scavenger predation after they had been slaughtered, as Lieutenant Orlov reported that here the radiation levels were at their highest. Because the sun was now beginning to set, Captain Sidorov pulled his unit back away from the irradiated area, intending to follow the trail at first light, ending the search for day 2. There was a growing sense of excitement inside the terminal as the feeling spread that we would soon find whatever it was that Colonel Andreev was searching for. Unfortunately, that was coupled in equal parts by a deep feeling of dread that we would find what Colonel Andreev was searching for. Despite Colonel Andreev's warnings against spreading unfounded rumors, there was almost widespread and unspoken speculation amongst the military personnel stationed at the airport terminal that the 2 infantry companies were looking for something other than the missing bodies of the people that had vanished over the past year. There were even whispers that what they were actually looking for was a demon that screeched in the dark forests after midnight. The professor, Alina, and I found ourselves seated again at our usual dinner table that evening, feeling totally useless, as we had done nothing the past few days except listen to reports coming in from the units. And although it was considerably less crowded now in the terminal as the majority of the soldiers were out in the snow, we still spoke in hushed yet excited tones about what we believed to be occurring out in the field. Colonel Andreev was at the other larger table across the room with his communications officer, meteorologist specialist, helicopter pilots, and his maintenance and supply chiefs, no doubt discussing the next morning's operations. When his meeting concluded, Colonel Andreev dismissed his men before walking back to the communications room.
"Excuse me, Colonel,"
said Alina, her voice echoing like a song.
"Would you care to join us for dinner? I would be happy to bring you a fresh cup of coffee."
Colonel Andreev stopped and looked at our lovely young intern, and I tried to suppress a laugh as Andreev attempted to produce a smile. His face simply didn't work that way, and his smile looked more like a grimace. "Thank you, Miss Ivanov, but I must return to the communications room. Perhaps when this operation is finished?"
"Well then, may I bring you a tray of food then? I've noticed that you've hardly eaten since last night."
The professor eyed her suspiciously, as if thinking, "What are you up to, girl?" "That is very kind of you to offer," answered Andreev. "Perhaps later on I will have a runner bring me a sandwich and some coffee. For now, it's getting rather late for you and the companies will be pulling out at first light. You all should get some rest. I expect you to be at the communications room first thing in the morning."
"One more thing, Colonel,"
persisted Alina, as Colonel Andreev turned to leave. To my surprise, Andreev turned again and smiled, although clearly trying to hide a perturbed look on his face.
"Colonel, what exactly are we looking for? Why are the professor and I really here?"
To my even greater surprise, Andreev let out a hearty chuckle as he looked around as if to see if someone was close enough to hear him. "I thought Mr. Zemyenin already told you." He looked at me sternly. "My younger cousin was never good at keeping secrets. Were you, Mikhail?" Turning to the professor and Alina, the stern expression never leaving his face, Andreev said, "Hopefully, you two will do a better job at it." Believe me, when we find what I'm looking for, you and the professor will be the first to know. Good evening," he said as he turned and walked away. "Well, he's a psychopath," said the professor when Colonel Andreev was far enough not to hear. It was a little after 5:30 in the morning when I was awoken by a frantic beating at the door to my janitor's closet. I sat up right away, hearing the sounds of commotion coming from outside. Throwing on some pants, I opened my door to see Alina and the professor standing outside, dressed in their army-issued cold-weather clothing. Behind them, sleepy-looking soldiers were rushing to their duty stations. Before I could utter anything, Alina excitedly said,
"Get dressed in your cold-weather clothing, Mr. Semyonin. Colonel Andreev didn't lie. They found something buried in the snow this morning, and we were the first to know. Your cousin told us to come get you and to tell you to bring your camera."
Snapped instantly awake by the news, I threw on my military-issued cold-weather gear, put on my civilian winter jacket with extra rolls of film and flashes stuffed into the pockets, and within 15 minutes, the three of us were standing in the pre-dawn cold out at the tarmac. An Mi-1 light utility helicopter warmed its engines behind us. Colonel Andreev was also there, but there were no other soldiers with him. "Okay," he announced over a bitterly cold wind that blew across the tarmac. "Now that we are alone, I can tell you what happened. At around 3 this morning, the sentries at Captain Sidorev's location reported hearing a high-pitched, guttural screech coming from the hills about 3 kilometers due south of their position, followed by the sound of trees being toppled over. Against my better judgment, I allowed Major Rogov and Captain Sidorev to pursue whatever was making that noise through the dark. And although they have failed to catch up to it, Sidorev's men did find a long trail of toppled trees, at least 1 kilometer long. The trees appear to be charred, and there is a deep gouge in the ground as if something had crashed there from a great height. The radiation levels here are elevated, about 15,000 millirems." Andreev looked at me. "And they followed the trail and found something buried in the clearing, under the snow. It was under the forest canopy, so that is why it was unseen from the air. Sidorev and his men are attempting to clear that snow away from it now." "Stanislav," I said. "Is it the Americans or is it—" "I don't know," he interrupted. "If my suspicions are true, then that is a question for the professor, and Alina will be best able to answer. You, Mikhail, will be there to document everything. It will be about an hour's flight from here to Captain Sidorev's location, so it would be getting lighter by the time you arrive there. And remember," he said, pointing to all 3 of us, "though there are soldiers at the site doing the digging and excavating, you are only to report any of your findings to Major Rogov or me personally. Nothing gets discussed with anyone else, and no notes will be taken. Only pictures. And Mikhail, I only want pictures of the object and anything else related to the object. I do not want any personnel who can be identified in the photos, especially the professor and his assistant. Understand?" I could only nod dumbly as Colonel Andreev ushered us into the small helicopter, giving us one final instruction to radio him immediately if something unexpected occurred. The flight from the airport to the site was roughly 45 minutes long, at which time the sky gradually lightened to a light purple. Because the actual site was deep within the forest, the pilot was forced to land in a clearing some ways away, where the infantry company's larger vehicles had also been parked. The cold was even worse here than it was at the airport, and I was proud that our young lads could still thrive in weather that froze the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad and the gates of Moscow. A squad was there to meet us and to escort us to the rest of the unit, where Major Rogov was supervising the excavation of the thing they had stumbled upon earlier. The going was rough in some places as we entered the tree line, the snow going up to my knees. But a path had been tramped out in the snow by soldiers earlier, and after a while, we reached the area where the trees and ground had been scorched by something which, indeed, looked to have crashed into the frozen forest at great speeds and from some height. The path of destruction seemed to go for at least 2 kilometers. I quickly began snapping photographs of the damage as the soldiers led us down the path of charred and fallen trees for about another 500 meters, which finally ended under a section of the forest which was heavy with trees. As we drew closer, all concerns that I had about the cold vanished and were replaced with a different chill, which froze my spirit. There, we found Major Rogov and Captain Sidorev, along with at least 24 soldiers clearing snow away from a large, gray-colored metallic object buried in the snow. "Professor," said Major Rogov briskly. His eyes were red and bloodshot. "This way, quickly. Mr. Zemyenin, Miss Ivanov, you two. Watch your steps over these fallen logs." The soldiers had worked hard to move snow and trees away to form a relatively clear 20-meter perimeter around the object. There were only a few soldiers near the object now, the rest standing around the perimeter they had cleared and looking nervously at us. Rogov turned to me. "Mr. Zemyenin, I'm sure that Colonel Andreev has instructed you as to the parameters and limitations of the pictures you are about to take. You know what pictures you are allowed to take, and what you are not allowed to take, correct?" "Yes, Comrade Major," I answered, turning to one of the soldiers standing within the perimeter. "Lieutenant Orlov," I said, shaking the young officer's hand. "Good morning. Is it safe to be here?" "Radiation levels here are elevated, Mr. Zemyenin," he answered frankly. "We can operate here for a few hours at a time, which is why we are rotating soldiers in and out every couple of hours. We will have more specialized uniforms brought in later on, once it gets lighter." "Over here, Professor," motioned Rogov. "What can you tell us of this thing?" I followed the professor and Alina, snapping pictures of the object as I walked. This object was still more than halfway buried in the snow. It was 5 meters high and 3 meters wide and seemed to be made of a very thick metal. It was shaped like a bell, although one that was caved in and was lying on its side. Several deep gouges were torn into its side, though it did not appear that the crash was the cause of the damage. The object had crashed in such a way that the barely visible Nazi swastika on the side of the object was almost face up.
Die Glocke,
Alina muttered, eyes wide and both hands over her mouth. "The what?" said Major Rogov. "It means the bell. It was supposedly one of Nazi Germany's last wonder weapons. One that supposedly was far more powerful than the V-series rockets and perhaps even more threatening than the nuclear bomb program." The soldiers around the perimeter stepped back away from the Nazi contraption, which had fallen from the sky over a year ago. "Turn about, lads," yelled Major Rogov. "Keep an eye out. Something in the hills was screaming last night, and you would not want it to take you while your backs were turned." While Major Rogov was admonishing his men, I stepped closer to the thing, which Alina called Die Glock, snapping pictures of every inch of it. The object was indeed caved in and covered in what looked like deep scratches and gouges. What appeared to be a door or hatch mounted next to the burned, faded swastika was blown out, allowing me to peer into the darkness inside. All the while I was snapping photographs. "Professor," said Major Rogov impatiently, "what exactly is this thing? What is the bell?" "I'm afraid that I'm not the subject matter expert on this thing, Major. That honor goes to my assistant, Miss Ivanov." "Miss Ivanov?" asked Major Rogov. "Well, come here, girl. Tell me what you know of this thing." I was still taking pictures when I heard Alina step forwards, then yelp as she tripped and fell in the snow. I got up and turned, seeing that a tree branch had snagged her boot and caused her to fall. Alina turned over, screaming as she crawled away from the tree branch. Professor Golubev was at her side, picking her up and pulling her away as Rogov stooped over the tree branch sticking out of the snow. Reaching down, Rogov pulled it from the snow. And it wasn't a tree branch. It was a gloved hand. It was attached to a dissected arm which had been ripped from the body. The torn and blood-stained sleeve in which the arm was in was that of a Nazi Waffen-SS officer. This is impossible,"
yelled Rogov. "Whoever this is, he died not long ago, perhaps within the last year." "Commander Rogov," said Captain Sidorev, "shall I order my men to clear way for more of the area? Perhaps we can find more." "No, Captain Sidorev," answered Rogov. "In fact, except for Lieutenant Orlov and yourself, pull your men back another 50 meters. I will continue the search here with the professor and his assistant." We stood around Major Rogov, staring with disbelief at the amputated arm which he still carried. There was no doubt that the black leather uniform sleeve was indeed that of a Waffen-SS soldier, as it bore the patch of a black eagle over the Nazi swastika, the SS in a black circle. "Commander Rogov," said Captain Sidorev after the last of his men had left the clearing, "the last of the Nazis were driven from our lands over 15 years ago, yet here is one of the fascists. How is that possible? Could there be more?" He turned, looking nervously at the collapsed bell-shaped objects. "Perhaps he died in the crash?" "Major," I said, "may I take photographs of the evidence?" "Of course, Mr. Zemyenin," said Rogov, putting the arm back down on the ground. "Meanwhile, everyone else, I want you to begin feeling around under the snow. Let us see if we can find any more pieces of our friend here." I took several pictures of the arm while the others, including Lieutenant Orlov and his men, began picking around in the snow. To my surprise, Alina was enthusiastically jabbing down at the snow with a tree branch, probing around to find more pieces of the dead Nazi's body. 10 meters from where she tripped over the arm, she found something else. Scooping snow away from around an unusual black mound, she announced,
"I found the torso, and it has an arm."
Lieutenant Orlov's men completed the process of scooping away the snow, revealing the headless, legless torso of the Nazi officer. The left arm was still attached, frozen entrails hanging out of the gaping wound below the abdomen. He looked like he had been ripped in half. Major Rogov stood over the remains, lighting a cigarette. "Mr. Zemyenin," he asked, "did you see any signs of flesh or human tissue within the wreckage?" "No, Comrade Major," I said. "None that I could see." "I do not think this man died in the crash. It appears he died after he walked away." Major Rogov searched within the torn black leather coat for any identity of the dead Nazi, but found nothing. "Mr. Zemyenin, please document this, then the rest of you, continue searching for any signs that there may have been others." As I stepped forward and began taking pictures, I noticed that the arm was extended, the gloved hand frozen in the shape of a C, as if it was holding something. I began digging around the area where the arm had been, wiping away snow until my hand brushed against something hard and roughly square-shaped. It was a brown leather pouch. Lifting it out of the snow, I undid the straps and gingerly pulled out the contents. It was a book. "Comrade Rogov!" I yelled. "I have found something!" The others quit searching and came to me, eyes focused on the strange artifact I had discovered. "What have you found, Mikhail?" said Rogov, standing next to me and looking over my shoulder. I carefully opened the book, surprised at how well preserved it was despite being buried for a year. "It appears to be a handwritten journal. It's written by an Oberst Hans Kimlische, a Nazi colonel," I said, shaking my head. "The name does not ring a bell." "Professor," said Major Rogov, "what can you tell us about this Oberst Kimlische?" "As I said earlier, Comrade Major, if a tiger or a panther tank fell out of the sky, or if the journal was written by Rommel or Himmler, I could be of better service. But I'm afraid that Miss Ivanov would be the best on the subject matter here." "Alina?" said Major Rogov. All eyes turned to the young university intern.
"Colonel Hans Kamlish?"
she said, rubbing her chin in thought.
"I wonder if it could be Colonel Hans Kammler. There is some speculation as to his actual name. But the man known as Hans Kammler, or Hans Kamlish, was a Waffen-SS officer who was said to be in charge of the research and development of some of Germany's secret Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons. May I please see the manuscript, Mr. Zemyenin?"
I looked at Major Rogov and he nodded.
Taking the Nazi artifact from me, Alina carefully leafed through the pages.
I do not believe that these pages are brittle with age, but from intense heat. This is interesting. Colonel Kamlish opens his journal with a long dissertation on something he describes as schneller als Zeitreisen, or traveling faster than time.
Carefully turning the pages, lest they crumble and fall apart, she came to a section in the middle of Kamlish's journal.
Here he is describing Die Glocke as not being a vehicle for conventional travel, but rather der Schlüssel zur Zeit, the key to time.
She turned to look at the bell-shaped wreckage buried in the snow, regarding it with a growing sense of awe. "Remarkable," said the professor. "We had long heard that the Nazis had been experimenting in such things as time travel from the German soldiers we had captured, but we dismissed them as the boastful ravings of soldiers who knew that their war was lost." The professor noticed the look of grave concern on Alina's face as she turned to the end of the journal. "What is it, Alina?"
It's nothing, Professor Gulubev,
she answered.
It's just that the last entry in the journal reads, Die Lehre ist nicht leer.
Alina shuddered. "What does that mean, Alina?" said Rogov impatiently. "Spit it out, girl." "Die Lehre ist nicht leer," I said, annoyed at Major Rogov for being so gruff with the young intern. "Means the void is not empty." "I see," said Rogov, staring back at me with barely hidden contempt as he held out his hand towards Alina. "I'll be taking that journal now, Miss Ivanov. We don't want any more damage to it before we can—" A piercing screech echoed across the frozen valley, causing the soldiers to bring up their weapons and look nervously around them, as the unearthly sound continued to reverberate, so powerful that it actually shook snow off of the skeletal limbs of trees. "There!" said Captain Sidorev, binoculars to his eyes and pointing to an elevated spot in the snow-covered forest to our northwest, and almost a kilometer and a half distant were trees being toppled over by some violent, unseen force moving slowly away from us. "Lieutenant," ordered Sidorev, "get your men aboard the BTRs and investigate what that is." Then, turning to Lieutenant Orlov, Sidorev said, "Orlov, your lads accompany the infantry. See if that thing is the source of your unusual radiation spikes." Another horrifying screech pierced the air, sending icicles through my veins and making me grateful that my days as a soldier were far behind me. It took some time to race back through the forest to get back to the vehicles. To their credit, our young soldiers did not hesitate to follow orders as they immediately mounted on their BTR-50 tracked armored transports and dashed across the open tundra, throwing up plumes of snow and frozen ground behind them. The rest of us, along with the remainder of Sidorev's infantry company, mounted back onto the wheeled BTRs and gas-light utility trucks and followed the tracked vehicles. Because the tracked vehicles had far better traction on the snow and ice, they quickly pulled ahead of us, as our wheeled vehicles attempted to follow behind in the tracks, which they had just made. The unseen thing which was making the unholy screeching as it toppled trees down was about 1 kilometer ahead of the lead-tracked BTRs. They followed it up to the tree line, where the wide armored vehicles could follow no longer. Radioing back that the tracks could go no further, Major Rogov instructed the forward platoons, almost 80 men total, to dismount and continue the pursuit on foot. The remainder of the infantry company would follow up once we reached their location. We were still half a kilometer from the tracks, our wheeled vehicles having difficulty keeping up in the thick snow. Sidorev's men were in constant contact with us over the radio, informing us that whatever they were pursuing was also being slowed down by the dense forest. Minutes later, we finally arrived at the location where the tracked BTRs were parked when the radio erupted with soldiers screaming. Automatic weapons fire echoed from the forest. Both Captain Sidorev and Major Rogov were yelling into their radios, demanding a situation report from the two platoons who were in contact with the thing. Horrific screeches from an otherworldly throat were mixed with frantic automatic weapons fire somewhere unseen in the forest ahead of us. A radio man from the first platoon was screaming incoherently, crying that his platoon leader had been torn apart by a demon. "Lieutenant Orlov!" yelled Major Rogov into the radio. "Put him on the radio!"
"He's dead, sir!"
screamed the radio man.
"His team was ahead of us. They died when the thing...
A sickening crunch came over the radio, like a spear going through bone and flesh, followed by a gurgling sound coming from the radio man.
"It's coming your way."
After that, the radio fell dead to static. The thing that emerged from the trees froze my blood in terror, making me a statue, my brain screaming vainly at my legs to move. It was like a crab, only its bony exoskeleton was black, and the 6 armored and spine-covered legs upon which it used to scuttle across the frozen ground were at least 20 meters long, ending in a point, much like that of a crab. The flat, oblong-shaped body was at least 45 to 50 meters in width and tapered at either side to 2 very long points, resembling spears, while all along the horror's armored flanks were a multitude of smaller, spike-shaped protrusions. Twin, black pincer arms extended 20 meters from the front of the body, each ending in 4 3-meter-long grasping claws. From its rear end, a thick, segmented tail rose 15 meters into the air, much like a scorpion's tail. However, where the stinger should have been, a black skeletal head shaped like some misshapen prehistoric alligator rested. And it was from within its horrific maw, lined with row upon row of pointed black teeth, came the blood-chilling screech which echoed for kilometers, emanating a foul odor which followed the monstrosity from the blackest pits of hell. That thing from the void, that thing which dwelled in the unspeakable in-between of time and space and which had somehow clung onto the Nazi time machine and was then dragged to Earth, to our motherland, scuttled with surprising speed towards us. It was a sound like armor clanking as it raced toward us, for indeed, its outer shell proved to be as hard as tank armor, as the rifle and machine gun rounds fired at it by our brave lads had no effect. With a terrifying screech as if it were howling in victory, the demon pounced upon the hasty skirmish line established by our soldiers, mercilessly tearing into them and their BTR transports. One brave heavy machine gunner aboard a wheeled BTR transport opened fire at the beast, attracting its attention and buying his comrades a few futile seconds to retreat. The BTR was snatched up by one of the demon's clawed appendages and nearly snapped in half, crushing the courageous heavy machine gunner that was trapped within. Captain Sidorev was on board another BTR, directing his gunner to continue firing his heavy machine gun while yelling at what was left of his unit to quickly climb aboard the remaining transports. In an unsettling display of intelligence and understanding, the demon from the void launched the crushed BTR in its claws at Captain Sidorev's vehicle. It landed with a terrible crash of metal and gore, instantly crushing Sidorev and the soldiers within. As if to ensure that no one remained alive in the twisted wreckage, the monster slammed its own claws down upon the ruined vehicles, flattening them and any soldier unlucky enough to have survived. Yet despite the bloodshed and carnage that I saw taking place only 100 meters in front of me, our young lads screaming and gurgling as they were ruthlessly impaled and taken up into the air to be fed into this hungry, hungry jaws, I unconsciously had my camera up, snapping photo after photo. Only a handful of soldiers were still alive, a few still firing their weapons, but most retreating to any vehicle available. My mind was just a fog of horrific images, my ears ringing from the sounds of the chaos and destruction, when I felt an urgent tug at my coat sleeve. Turning in shock, I saw Alina pulling at me. Her mouth was moving, but I could not hear what she was saying. Still tugging frantically at my sleeve, she was desperately pointing behind her towards Major Rogov. Major Rogov was only 10 meters away, waving his hands towards us to hurry up and get to his vehicle. Me, Alina, and the professor were only able to take 2 steps towards Rogov when we were overcome by a huge shadow. Major Rogov was literally split in half from a spike-tipped leg which punctured him from head to foot, A second, spike-tipped leg crashed down on his Gaz-67 Jeep, impaling the driver as the gigantic spike crashed through the roof of the vehicle. The thing looked down at us with its black reptilian skull. Its hungry maw opened. It stared at us with black eyes seemingly hidden behind empty eye sockets. I reached into my coat pocket, feeling for the Makarov pistol with Sergeant Galkin issued to me, and realized that I had forgotten it back in the terminal. Not that it would have helped us. The air was now hot, reeking with the stench of burning sulfur, the demon, and the sickening metallic odor of spilled blood. I held Alina and the professor close, awaiting the inevitable when the chatter of machine gun fire ripped into the side of the beast's head. It turned, raging in anger as it saw the last two-wheeled BTRs escaping towards the north. The demon from the void turned and bounded after them. "Quickly!" I yelled. "They might not get far or last long." I hustled Alina and the professor across the bloody snow towards the last remaining vehicle that looked to still be operable. It tracked an armored BTR-50. Though it was only 50 meters away from us, it felt as if we had slogged through several kilometers over several hours just to reach it. My heart sank as I heard the machine guns fall silent behind me, followed by the tearing of metal and the horrified screams of doomed soldiers. Not wanting to turn around because I was too fearful of what I knew I would see, I literally tossed Alina and the professor into the tracked vehicle, motioning them to lie quiet and still in the hopes that the demon might somehow have forgotten us, and praying that the armored sides of the vehicle would shield us if the demon didn't. I looked up to see a soldier standing out of the hatch, stoically manning a machine gun. "Where's the driver?" I yelled up at him. The soldier was young, perhaps not even in his 20s, and tears flowed down his face. The driver's dead," the soldier said. "The driver's dead, and I don't know how to operate this thing." "Leave this to me." I jumped back in surprise as the professor hustled up the troop compartment towards the front of the vehicle, with all the energy and enthusiasm of a man half his age.
"Professor,"
said Alina, her hands reaching out as if to stop him.
"Where are you going?"
The engine of the BTR-50 roared to life as the rattle of machine gun fire echoed into the hull of the vehicle. "Wait!" I yelled. "What are you doing, soldier? You'll only attract its attention." "That demon killed my unit," yelled the soldier as he fired his machine gun. He was screaming in anger as he fired, hundreds of spent shell casings falling into the vehicle. From my vantage point inside the vehicle, I could only see the soldier's lower torso and legs. There was a hard thump on the roof, and the soldier's yells were abruptly cut short, as his body was literally lifted up and out of the gunner's hatch. I ran forwards to pull him back, but it was far too late. I caught a brief glimpse of the demon bringing the unfortunate soldier up into its mouth before I reached up and slammed the gunner's hatch shut. Immediately, I was tossed forwards as the professor put the BTR in gear and we launched backwards. The rear of the vehicle hit something hard and I heard something like a tree branch snapping, followed by the beast shrieking in pain and surprise. "It's been nearly 20 years since I last drove one of these things." Slamming the vehicle into gear again, I was tossed into Alina's lap as the professor launched the ungainly vehicle forwards. I looked up from between Alina's legs. She was blushing as she stared down at me, completely embarrassed. I said, "I'm sorry, Alina. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry." I stood up quickly, legs wobbling as the BTR rolled over the snow at speeds that it was not safely designed to travel. Thankfully, the tracks on this heavier vehicle gave it much better maneuverability and speed on the ice and snow over its wheeled counterparts. I cautiously popped open the gunner's hatch and looked behind us. The demon was still in pursuit, but two of its front legs were bent in an odd angle as a result of the professor's fortuitous mistake in shifting gears, thus making it difficult for the demon to keep up with us. Still, though its injury had forced it to slow down, the horror was still persistent and angry as it scuttled after us, creating with its movements the clinking sound as if we were being pursued by knights on horseback. I pulled out my camera and began snapping pictures of the demon as it lumbered after us. Then, slamming the hatch shut again, I began rummaging through the BTR's commander station.
"What are you looking for, Mr. Zemyanin?"
asked Alina as she hung on for dear life while the BTR rumbled and shook. "I'm looking for the radio equipment." "Aha!" I yelled, finally finding the hand mic and turning on the radio. "Professor, do you have any idea where we're headed?" "Of course, my boy," yelled the professor, sounding as if he was having the time of his life.
We were on a trail headed roughly northwest towards Dyatlov's Pass. However, the trail we are now on will become significantly narrower soon. Okay, I said. Got it. Then, yelling into the radio, I said, Colonel Andreev, this is Zemyenin. Any unit on this frequency, this is Mikhail Zemyenin. Colonel Andreev, are you there? I had not learned any of the radio call signs, and frankly, we didn't have time for such formalities.
Last station, this is Oscar 1-3. Who is this? How did you get on a military frequency?
This is Mikhail Zemyenin. I'm a civilian journalist. Something has gone terribly wrong. Major Rogov, Captain Siderev, we found...
Mr. Zemyenin,
yelled the voice on the other end.
It is strictly forbidden for unauthorized civilians to utilize military radio frequencies. Put Captain Sidorev on the line. Break.
Came another voice over the radio.
This is Colonel Andreev.
I breathed a sigh of relief.
Mikhail, is that you?
Yes, it's me. Look, we found something. It took Major Rogov and Captain...
Break!
Yelled Andreev angrily into the radio again.
Mikhail, calm down. Listen carefully. Are you facing another incident like the one in the Kurgan Mountains?
I slowed my breathing, remembering the time as a child when Stanislav rescued me from being eaten by a wolf. Yes, I said as calmly as I could. But this is far worse.
Okay, Mikhail. Listen closely. Tune the radio to the following frequency. It is a secured channel.
Doing as I was told, I switched the frequency to the one in which Stanislav had given me. Behind us, I could hear the screeches of the demon outside of our armored hull getting louder. It seemed that not only did it not grow tired, it was also getting closer. How are we looking, Professor? I yelled. This clunking thing isn't as responsive or maneuverable as my old T-34 tank, he replied. How are we supposed to defend the motherland against NATO using equipment like this piece of shit, huh? Anyway, to answer your question, we will either run out of the road or fuel if something doesn't happen soon.
Mikhail, this is Andreev.
His voice boomed over the secure channel.
What is happening out there? Where are you?
We're approximately 80 kilometers northeast of your position. We're leaving Captain Sidorev's designated search area, traveling roughly due east up the path that leads to Dyatlov's Pass. As quickly as possible, I explained our desperate and impossible situation, of the thing which ambushed us, and the loss of Captain Sidorev's entire motorized infantry company. To my surprise, Stanislav did not sound the least bit doubtful of my story.
Okay. Is the target still pursuing you?
Yes, I said. This was followed by a loud, high-pitched roar coming from behind us, which echoed inside the crew compartment.
Oh my god, Mikhail. Was that it?
Yes, Stanislav. It is right behind us even as I speak. No more than 100 meters, I'd estimate. The professor says that we will either run out of road or fuel soon.
The professor is driving the BTR? How do you get yourself into such misadventures, Mikhail?
Andreev's voice returned to being cold and collected.
Look, Mikhail. I have 2 MiG-21 fighters en route to your location. They're about 5 minutes away and are armed with air-to-ground weaponry. I'm also on the way with my security platoon armed with RPGs. We're coming in by helicopter from the southeast. Just stay ahead of the beast until we get there.
We rumbled along as fast as the professor could get the BTR to go, but it was with growing horror that we could hear the demon screeching getting louder and louder the closer it came. My heart sank when I heard the roar of the beast seemed to overtake our vehicle, and I realized that we would be torn apart before the fighters arrived. Then, with a shock which ran up my spine, I felt a glimmer of hope. The last ground-shaking roar was that of a fighter jet. I opened up the hatch to see their beautiful, sleek, silver forms zoom past us, then bank sharply around.
Attention, attention, attention. This is Strike Lead. Do you read? Pilots, this is Mikhail Zemyenin. I'm in the BTR below you. I see you, Zemyenin,
said the MiG-21 flight leader.
Where is Major Rogov? Never mind that right now. What type of ordnance do you carry? We have air-to-ground rockets and 2 500-kilogram bombs.
The 2 silver MiG-21 fighters flashed low over our heads again, and the horror behind us stopped briefly to shriek at them, raising one of its massive claw arms to swipe at the jets.
They are unguided,
the pilot added.
The professor gunned the engines of the BTR harder, trying to widen the distance between us and the demon from the void. At this point, we were less than 100 meters away from the thing.
So it's likely that we may be hit as well. Is that what you're saying? Perhaps,
said the pilot, apologetically.
You are danger close to the blast. What is that thing that's chasing you? That is the last gift of the Nazis to the motherland,
I answered. At this point, the narrow trail curved towards the right around an outcropping. The heavily snow-laden sloping mountain to our right rose nearly 300 meters, while the drop-off still to our left fell away into a ravine 50 meters below us. The professor had to slow the vehicle to make the right turn on the slippery snow and ice as the creature lumbered steadily on behind us.
Pilot,
I yelled.
We are at the approach to the Kolat Mountains that lead to the Dyatlov Pass. Can you strike the outcroppings that are ahead of us and to our right?
The two MiGs soared overhead again, their powerful jet engines drowning out the screeches of the monster.
You cannot be serious, Mr. Zemyanin. Your vehicle will be caught up as well. Not if Professor Golubev is as good a track driver as he was a T-34 driver,
I answered.
I was the best in the entire goddamned Red Army, yelled the professor from the driver's compartment. This tin can is nothing. Go ahead. Do what you have to do. I'll make this thing fly if I have to. Pilot, commence your run. Commence your run. Okay, we're going in. Keep your heads down and fly as quickly as possible. You will only have seconds to react.
Climbing down from the hatch and taking a seat next to Alina, I plopped an oversized vehicle crewman's helmet on her head before hugging her close to me. Hold on tightly, Alina. Things are going to get bumpy.
What's happening, Mr. Zemyanin?
Something crazy. Hang on. The air was suddenly filled with a hollow whooshing sound like that of a hurricane being forcefully pushed through a metal pipe as dozens of rockets impacted into the mountain beside us, followed by the earth-shattering vibrations of 4 500-kilogram bombs exploding nearly above us on the slopes as we rushed past. The rumble of the ground did not subside after the ordnance exploded, but rather picked up greatly, causing our little armored BTR to toss and tumble like a trawler caught up in a tidal wave as millions of tons of snow came crashing down the mountainside towards us. Hang on! This is going to be close! The BTR violently heaved to one side and I hit my head against something metallic as a raging avalanche of snow and ice crashed down the slopes of the mountain, tipping our BTR over and into the ravine. Colonel Andreev, sir, there are survivors. In the cold, dark space which I found myself, I could hear the muffled voice of a soldier somewhere outside, followed by frantic digging. I'm not sure how long I was unconscious, but I was absolutely freezing. My breathing labored. I was not upright at least, not that I could tell, but I could feel a warm body wrapped in my arms, soft moans filling the cold, pitch blackness. Alina, I said. Are you okay? My head was pounding and I feared that I had suffered a concussion.
I think so,
Came a soft, pained reply.
Professor?
I'm fine, dear, came a weak voice from the driver's compartment. This isn't the first time I've been upside down in a tracked vehicle, but to tell you the truth, after the Battle of Kursky, I thought that would be my last time. Professor Golubev chuckled and said, Ouch, ouch, ouch. Okay, that was a bad idea. Try to relax, Professor, I said, talking to the darkness. Don't try to move, you may have some broken ribs. I tried to move inside this pitch-black metal coffin, but found that I was pinned by something heavy which was pushing on my back, trapping my legs. Probably the radio mount. I reached up and gently touched my temple, feeling something warm and sticky running down my fingers. Damned Nazis, yelled Professor Golubev. In 1943, at Kursk, my T-34 was struck by a Nazi Tiger tank, flipping us over. They tried to kill me then and they're trying to kill me now. Listen, you tell the next generation to always remember to fight the Nazis or else they'll send goddamn space goblins after you or something. I will, Professor. If we get out of here, I promise I will. From what I could tell, the BTR had flipped over on top of us, trapping us in a small pocket of air under its bulk. I was on my side, pressed against a bed of snow. Alina was in a fetal position next to me. But this may have also been our frozen tomb had it not been for the valiant efforts of the soldiers outside digging us out. 30 frigid minutes later, I was standing in the glorious sunshine of that frigid mountain pass, my head bandaged and my arm in a sling, looking down at the hole which the soldiers had dug under the snow to rescue us. In reality, the situation wasn't as bad as it seemed at the time. The professor, true to his word, had just narrowly gotten us past the edge of the avalanche, which had only just clipped the rear of the BTR, flipping it over, but only burying the back end. Most of the BTR was actually sticking up out of the snow, though it was inverted. "You're very fortunate, Mikhail," said Colonel Andreev, offering me a cigarette. "The MiG pilots managed to radio us your coordinates before they left the station." I leaned over, lighting the cigarette on the colonel's lighter, inhaling deeply. I looked across the overturned BTR to the narrow pass where Alina, attentive as always, was standing next to Professor Golubev, telling him to sit still while the medics checked over him. Golubev was seated on a canvas chair, regaling the two medics of his time in the Great Patriotic War. "So there were four of the Motherland's T-37s against 20 of the fascist Tiger tanks. My tank got 9 of those bastards before the remaining 30 Nazi bastards put my tank out of commission. So this is nothing," he said, waving his hands at the overturned BTR. "Did your friend hit his head, miss?" said one of the medics.
No. At least I don't think so. The professor is always like this. Last week, it was 50 Tiger tanks.
I allowed myself a quick smile. What relationship did sweet young Alina have with her professor, and why was she always so attentive to him? I looked sideways at my cousin. "How much of what we were searching for did you already know existed, Stanislav?" I whispered. "I knew about as much as you will be allowed to report, Mikhail," he answered, lighting a cigarette of his own. Around him, armed soldiers were securing the area looking for surviving comrades, which I knew they would not find. Other soldiers were busily taking pictures of the avalanche and the overturned BTR while the other team of Lieutenant Orlov's unit was scanning the area for traces of radiation. Looking to me but not daring to ask what happened to their lieutenant. "So, Major Rogov, Lieutenant Orlov, the other soldiers," I said. "All, unfortunately, lost in the avalanche," said Andreev. "Just like those people who have gone missing this past year. Just as those hikers at what they now call Dyatlov's Pass. And just like the demon that was chasing you. All lost to freak avalanches." The colonel took a long drag of his cigarette. "And just like your camera, Mikhail, I'm sorry." Instinctively, I felt for my camera, realizing with horror that all the proof of everything that we had sacrificed and died to find, the Nazi machine, the monster from the void, was somewhere lost under the overturned BTR. "Don't worry, Mikhail," continued Andreev. "We will recover your camera, though I fear it may be too damaged to return to you. No matter though, the pictures which my men were taking of the avalanche will be proof enough of the tragedy which befell Captain Sidorev's men when you post your story." 2 days later, Colonel Andreev's driver brought me, Professor Golubev, and Alina to the train station. By then, almost all traces of the Soviet military ever being at the airport had vanished, although Captain Kravtsov's men remained at the site of the avalanche for an additional week, just in case. My official report to Pravda, which I already suspected had been tossed in the trash, had been redacted and rewritten for me by the military. My cousin, Colonel Andreev, brought me the latest copy of Pravda the morning that we left the airport terminal. As promised, the front page story was a dedication to the heroic Major Rogov, Captain Sidorev, and the rest of the soldiers who were caught up in an avalanche while attempting to find the missing people who, more than likely, had also been swept up in similar, sudden avalanches months earlier. The story was credited to me, Mikhail Zemyanin, a trusted civilian journalist. All the government needed was my name and my presence to lend credence to the narrative that avalanches were the cause of all the lost life in the area surrounding Dyatlov's Pass. Within a week, all of the events at the pass faded into obscurity. In addition, there was absolutely no reporting of the night a highly secretive military convoy which escorted a large, flatbed truck carrying an unusual bell-shaped object under a heavy tarp down from the region of Dyatlov's Pass. Colonel Andreev's men searched me and Professor Golubev thoroughly for any contraband items which might have pointed to a different conclusion from that which the military wanted the world to know. Alina was a different story. She, pretending to be just a naive young girl who simply tagged along behind her mentor, Professor Golubev. The soldiers didn't give her much of a search. The train ride to Koltsovo was quiet, each of us contemplating the events of the last few days and still feeling the shock of being alive. It reminded me of how I felt all those years ago when my airborne unit was in Romania, and I had heard that the war against the fascists was over, and I was still in one piece. Alina sat next to Professor Golubev, sleeping most of the way as the professor regaled me with tales from the war. Sometime later, I excused myself and went to the dining carriage to stretch my legs and to bring some bread and cheese back to our coach. By the time I got back, the professor was already fast asleep, and a few minutes later, I joined them in the blissful void of slumber. It was early evening when our train finally pulled into Koltsovo station, and the call came for those who were leaving to disembark. The professor and Alina gathered their things and opened the door to the coach to leave. Alina hesitated, stopping to turn and kiss me on both cheeks.
It was good to meet you, Mr. Zemyanin. Thank you for protecting me when our vehicle turned over. I would not be here if you hadn't. I wish you much success with the paper.
Alina, I said quietly, before she and Professor Golubev could leave the train at Koltsovo for the connecting train which would take them back to St. Petersburg. Alina looked around as passengers began debarking behind her. Then, seeing as no one was paying her any attention, slipped a small leather pouch out of her bag and handed it to me. "You took a big risk getting this out," I whispered.
I did it for those whom we lost. It's up to you now.
"You make sure that the truth gets out someday, will you, Mikhail?"
said the professor before taking Alina's hand and stepping out to blend in with the crowd.
"Say, Alina, did I tell you about the time I shot down famous German ace Hans Rudel? It was a cold afternoon as we approached the German border, and a line of fascist Stuka dive bombers ascended from the clouds."
Yes, Professor, but I would be happy to hear the story again.
"Really?" said the professor. "How about the time when I shot a fascist U-boat right out from under them with my tank? We were on the Baltic coast, you see."
Yes, Professor, you told me that one also.
Then it appears that I have no more tales of heroism to tell anymore.
Not even one where you drove a tank while being chased by a horrible monster which the Nazis accidentally brought back with them from the void?
Giggled Alina.
"No," replied the professor. "Technically it wasn't a tank, but tell me how that one goes, will you, my girl?"
I chuckled to myself as I watched the two get swallowed up by the crowd, disappearing down the terminal as a light snow began to fall. I walked back to my now empty coach, clinging tightly to my travel bag as the train pulled out of the station. It took almost 2 days of travel and was well after dark before my train finally arrived to Moscow station. The weather had warmed up slightly since I had left, and already the first signs of the streets and cobblestone sidewalks were peering tentatively out from under the snow. I debated as to whether or not to call Mr. Satyukov and tell him that I was home, but I decided against it. Not because it was already dark and I was afraid of disturbing him. Quite the opposite. For an older gentleman, Satyukov was quite active, and he'd more than likely want to meet me at a pub for drinks and maybe a bowl of hearty solyanka soup. Mr. Satyukov thinking that the hot meats, sausages, and vegetables in the soup would be just the thing to fill my belly as we discussed my trip. and though I did admit to being hungry, I was rather anxious to get back home to my flat as quickly as possible. There was no telling if there were eyes on me at the moment. It was past 10 o'clock when a cab finally dropped me off at my flat. It was dark inside as I quickly doffed my coat and shoes on my chair, and made my way to the study where I laid my travel bag on the desk. Closing the blinds, I then flicked on the desk lamp, unstrapping my bag and pulling out the small leather pouch, which I had stuffed under my clothes. Unwrapping it, I carefully laid out its contents. There before me sat the journal of Oberst Hans Kimlische, along with the last roll of film from my camera. Leaning back, I sighed deeply. Alina, you clever, clever girl. Pouring myself a glass of vodka, I raised a toast to my cousin, Colonel Andreev, who had, once again, saved me from being devoured by wolves. You were right, Stanislav. I was never good at keeping secrets.